I am. So, this is the teaching ministry of Starlight Church, coming to you from Tustin, California. And last week we started a series on Daniel. And this is not meant to be a verse by verse analysis of the book of Daniel, but I'm going to hit high points and concentrate on various things within the book. The book obviously is a book of prophecy written by a guy named Daniel. And let me give you just a little bit of the historical setting so you can get a feel for what's going to come and why this book is so important. We mentioned last week that of all the books in the Bible, this book is attacked more than any other. Genesis is up there close, because if you're an antagonist, or if you don't believe the Bible, or if you have something against the Bible, the first book you're basically going to go after is the book of Genesis, in that it is the book of beginnings. It gives the explanation for all the things that come and ensue afterwards. So Genesis is going to get attacked left and right. But we get to the book of Daniel, and Daniel is attacked even more than the book of Genesis because of the clarity and the detail and the phenomenal aspect of the prophecies given within this book, and the prophecies having to do with world history that will ensue from the time of Daniel until the end. And these prophecies are so intricate, they are so precise, that the world just can't abide by it. And so they have to find some reason to go after this book. Daniel was a Jew. More technical difficulties. You have to bear with us here. I'm going to turn this off.
That's what I said.
So I apologize for this, folks. But like I said, technology, you got to love it. Daniel was a Jew that in 606 BC, Nebuchadnezzar came down, conquered the nation of Israel, and took the nation captive. Within this wave of captives taken back to Babylon, Daniel and his three buddies were part of this group. I mean, virtually the whole nation was captured and taken out. There was a few little herdsmen and a few shepherds and so forth left to, just watch the sheep and the goats and so forth. But for the most part, 99% of the people were taken out of the country and taken captive to Babylon, of which they stayed for a period of 70 years. So it's in that 70-year period in Babylon, in a foreign nation, foreign language, foreign customs and everything, that Daniel found himself in as a young man, maybe late teens, early 20s or so. He gets there, and because of his brains and his charisma or expertise or just personality or something, he is assigned to the palace and the government aspect of daily life. And there's a 3-year training period for these guys. They have to learn the language, they have to learn the customs, they have to learn how to conduct themselves within the government and within the palace and so forth. And one of the things that they had to learn and to adapt was the customs of Babylon. In that 3-year probation period, they were going to learn the language, and they were going to learn to comport themselves as far as the king is concerned in his presence. So they had a regimen. They had a plan that they would take these boys and they would convert them basically into Babylonians. the first thing they did to these poor guys, they made them eunuchs, because they're working in the palace, they're working for the government, they have proximity to the harem, the girls, the wives of the king. And in this culture, in this day and age, the king didn't want anybody else messing with those girls that was going to have the prospect of having a kid involved. And so if you're going to work in the government, if you're going to work in the palace, if you're going to have proximity to the harem and the wives of the king, first thing they do to you, they make you a eunuch. So there's no question about who those kids are running around. They are Nebuchadnezzar's kids, not somebody else's. Well, Daniel, the guys, they didn't have any say over that. They didn't, check that box and say, oh yeah, I vote to be a eunuch today. That was just, that's it. Sorry, guys. That's the way it is. But there was another element, and that is that they had to adapt to Babylonian customs as far as the food and the drink was concerned. Now they have a choice. They can maintain their testimony before God, or they can adapt to the local customs and the local traditions of the country in which they find themselves captive. And they made a conscious decision that they are going to take a stand as far as the testimony is concerned, because if you go back to the book of Leviticus, you find out that there are certain dietary and regulatory laws as far as eating and drinking for the Jews were concerned. Chapter after chapter after chapter after chapter about the foods they can eat, the way that the food is prepared, the combination of certain foods and so forth, when you can eat certain foods. I mean, there's a whole big list of do's and don'ts as far as food is concerned. So in this element, now they had no choice on the eunuch part. That was just done to them. But on this part, they could make a stand, and they did make a stand. And they said, we're not going to do it. It's an affront to our God, and we're just not going to do it. Look over in Daniel chapter 1. Daniel chapter 1, and look at verse 8. Daniel 1:8. But Daniel purposed in his heart. So this is a conscious decision that he made. This is that stand that he had to make. And this stand, it's not just a frivolous type thing. This could be potentially a life and death thing. If the king tells you you're going to eat a certain type of food and you're going to drink a certain type of beverage, you're drinking a certain type of food and eating a certain type of stuff here, period. There's no discussion. But Daniel knew that if he was going to adopt that aspect of his public life, then his testimony is worthless. So he said, look at verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore, he requested the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So he brings attention to himself. He makes a deal with the prince of the eunuchs. He says, look, give me 10 days. You guys want us to eat all this sumptuous food, this rich food, this, the meat. Let's go to Ruth's Chris every night type thing. He said, I don't want to do that. And the eunuch said, well, no, you've got to maintain a certain standard for the king. The king doesn't want, emaciated kids. He doesn't want, sickly looking kids and so forth working for him. You got to come up to a certain standard. Daniel says, I'll make you a deal. You give us 10 days, him and his 3 buddies. You give us 10 days the way we want to eat. And at the end of that 10 days, you check us out compared to the other guys who are on the king's regiment and see how it works out. So the eunuch said, well, okay, I'll give you 10 days. At the end of that 10-day period, brings in the regular guys and brings in Daniel and his three buddies, and there was no contest. Daniel and his buddies looked 10 times better than the other guys. And so the prince of the eunuchs said, go ahead, you maintain your own regimen and your own diet. Verse 17, same chapter, Daniel chapter 1, verse 17. As for these four children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. You know what the verse before this had to do with? Verse 16. Then Melzar took away the portion of the meat and the wine that they should drink and gave them purse. Purse is basically a vegetarian diet. Right after they made their stand, the very next verse, verse 17, states that God gave them knowledge in all wisdom and understanding, and he gave Daniel wisdom as far as dreams and interpretation of dreams is concerned. You honor God, God will honor you. It's a biblical precedent. So they maintained their testimony. They took their stand. They got their way, and God rewarded them for it. Look at verse 20, chapter 1 still. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them. Now, the 3 years have gone by at this point. They're standing before the king for their audition to see if they're going to be eligible to stay within the palace and work as government employees and so forth. So in all matters of wisdom and understanding that the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers that were in his realm. So God honored these kids for their stand, for their testimony, and for the guts that it took to go against the king's wishes and say, we can't do this. The Bible is written. I'm going to back up for just a second and incorporate something in here. The Bible is written from the standpoint of a Jewish perspective. God knew, and there were obviously at this time, there was people in South America, there's people in Central America, there's people in North America. There's a gazillion people in Asia, you know, the Far East, Japan, China. There was Russia. You had, you know, the Philippines and the South Sea Islands. You had Southeast Asia. In other words, there were people all over the world. But from a biblical perspective, as far as the Bible is concerned, it has to do with that portion of the world that had to do with the Jews. And specifically, it's that portion of what would later become the Roman Empire. If you can see a picture of the Mediterranean Sea, you've got Italy, which Rome is right there in the middle, city of Rome. And you've got Greece up to the northeast of that. You've got the whole southern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, which is North Africa. And on the eastern part of the Mediterranean Sea, you have Turkey, you have Israel, you have Jordan, Syria, Babylon, Persia. All that part would later become known as the eastern arm of the Roman Empire. So from a biblical perspective, that is the area of the world that the Bible is concerned about. It's one of the reasons that, for instance, America is not mentioned in the Bible, because America as it stands, where it is, it had no bearing in a direct relationship with the nation of Israel, as far as, daily intercourse back and forth, trade and warfare and so forth. Same thing with sub-Saharan Africa. By the time you get down to Ethiopia and, below the Sahara Desert, the rest of Africa doesn't factor in with the Bible. Not because they didn't count or weren't important. It's just simply they had no direct bearing on the nation of Israel. So we have a situation where you have a little nation theoretically stuck in the middle of the geographical center of the earth. And it is the tail. It is wagging the dog on this whole thing. Up until now, Israel, until 606 BC, Israel has basically been their own masters. There were times where they had trouble with the indigenous people, the Philistines, the Girgasites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all these little, enclaves of people within the nation that they didn't totally subdue. They gave them periodic trouble and so forth. But for the most part, Israel was Israel. It wasn't until 606 BC when Israel, at this point, the two southern tribes and the city of Jerusalem, that they were taken, surrounded by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians. The city was taken, the walls were knocked down, the temple was destroyed, the town was destroyed. Everything was just taken right down to the ground. At that point, something happened biblically in this world. Instead of Israel being the focus point, it now came into a period of time of which is referred to as the times of the Gentiles. Israel would come back 70 years later to the land. But by then, they were not really their own masters from then on. By the time Jesus was born, it was Rome that was in control politically of Israel. They still had their temple, they had their high priests, they had all their laws and so forth. They had their Pharisees and the Sadducees, but they also had Pilate. They also had Roman governors, Roman legions, Roman soldiers in the land. So they weren't their own masters anymore. It was the times of the Gentiles. And from the time of Babylon until the time that Jesus comes back in Revelation chapter 19, that whole period of time, more than 2,000 years, is now called the times of the Gentiles. The book is written in two languages, and this is an interesting breakdown because very few books are written, were originally written in more than one language. It was usually either Greek or Hebrew. But in this instance, the two languages picked were Hebrew, and the other was Aramaic. Chapters 1, all of chapter 1, and chapter 2 up until verse 3 are written in Hebrew, because these verses had to do still with the Israelites. It had to do with Daniel, his three buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these three buddies, by the way, who stood with Daniel on their protest and the food thing, these are the same three boys of the fiery furnace fame: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So this was a tight group, a very, very high group as far as spiritual understanding and guts. So we have this times of the Gentiles. We have the language thing. The first part of the book is written in Hebrew because it has to do with still Hebrew kids. From Daniel chapter 2, verse 3, and to the end of the book of Daniel, it's written in Aramaic. Aramaic was the language of Babylon, obviously. And it's interesting to note that when Jesus was raised, he was raised in northern Israel, which is way up by Syria, not really that far from Babylon, as far as the crow flies. And some say that Jesus' first language, his natural language, his primary language was Aramaic, not Hebrew, which makes sense because the Roman Empire at that time, they had two primary languages, as far as the empire as a whole. You had the government language, which was, interestingly, still Greek. And then you had the everyday language that the Romans spoke. So a lot of people, most of the people back in this time, they were multilingual. They could speak Hebrew, they could speak Greek, they could speak Latin, they could speak all kinds of languages. And so it's not surprising that Jesus' primary language was probably Aramaic, because that was still the language of Chaldea, of Syria, and northern Israel at that time. You get down into southern Israel, Jerusalem, and so forth, and it was primarily Hebrew that they spoke. So I'm sure Jesus was bilingual, at least, that he could understand and speak Greek, or probably Greek too, but at least Aramaic and Hebrew. So you have this diversity of languages all over the place. You have this mixing of people all over the place. It was a chaotic time in that respect. But when we get into verse 3 of chapter 2, this is where the wheels fall off and it really starts to get exciting. Turn over to chapter 2 and we'll look at verse 3. Daniel chapter 2, verse 3. And the king said unto them, now this is the soothsayers, the magicians, all the guys at court that, it's their job to interpret dreams and so forth. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream, and my spirit was troubled to know the dream. Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac, O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. Well, this is the same con that, carnies have been using for years. Magicians, fortune tellers, prognosticators, tarot readers. I mean, the whole bit. You tell me what the dream was, and I'll tell you what it means. Well, good grief, who can't check that box? You tell me a dream, I'll tell you what it means. My telling of what that means absolutely nothing. But how would you know? And these guys, they made their living doing this. Tell us the dream, and we'll give you the answer. But for some reason, on this occasion, Nebuchadnezzar says, no. We're going to flip this. If you guys are as hot as you think you are, if you're the cat's meow, if you're as good as you say, then you tell me, not just the interpretation, you tell me what the dream was. Oops. Now these guys had the fear of God put into them, because there's no way they're coming up with this one. There's no way they're going to try to figure that out. Look at verse 5, chapter 2, verse 5. The king answered. Now, this is after they said, no, you show us the dream and we'll give you the interpretation. He comes back with this. The king answered and said unto the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make known unto me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. You know what a dunghill is? Basically, to clean it up and so forth. It's an outhouse. You had people going around because they didn't have, for the most part, they didn't have indoor plumbing in those days. They didn't have sewer systems and so forth. So in the morning, you would bring your stuff out that had accumulated through the day before and the night, whatnot, and people would collect it and they'd throw it in certain areas that were designated as a dunghill. He said, if you can't show me the interpretation and the dream, your house is just going to be made an outhouse, a dunghill. That's it. And I'm going to cut you in pieces. You're dead. You're toast. You're history. This put the fear of God into them. Well, this threat to kill all these guys, that threat also included Daniel and his three buddies, because they were in this class of people. That was their government job as such. So if you can't tell me what the interpretation and what the dream was, you're toast. Well, dreams and prophecy in the Bible, they are the provision or the purview of God. God gives us visions. He gives us dreams. And if we're going to figure them out, he has to give us the interpretation of these things. It's not unusual for God to work through dreams and visions. Remember Joseph, when he was engaged to Mary, before they had come together, the Bible said, she was still a virgin. He hadn't, done anything with her. But he finds out she's pregnant. Well, he knows he's not the dad on this thing, but she's pregnant, so he puts two and two together, and he's going to put her away. He's going to divorce her. Now, if you were engaged in those days and the engagement didn't come to a marriage thing, and you got rid of them or you stopped the thing, it's the same as a divorce. So he was going to divorce her. And God came to him in a dream and said, Joseph, don't worry about it. She's still pure. She's still a virgin. She hadn't stepped out on you. She hasn't done anything wrong. But she is pregnant. But she is pregnant with the Holy Ghost. God came down and he implanted that little baby in her. So go ahead. Take her as your wife. She's still pure. She's still a virgin. Don't worry about it. Well, this was conveyed to Joseph in a dream. Joseph, way back in Genesis, he gets dreams, and he is given the ability and the privilege of interpreting these dreams. So all through biblical history, God works through visions and dreams with certain people. But they are, at the end of the day, they belong to God. And God uses dreams and visions and prophecy to put a stamp of approval, if you please, on his authority. He is showing you, look, I know the past. I know the future. Nobody else does. And if I feel like conveying that information to you by way of a dream or a vision, I can do it because I know the end from the beginning. We're going to look at a few verses here real quick, starting in Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 46. In this whole section, Isaiah 40, 46, 47, 43, 44, this whole 4 or 5 chapters in here are basically written by God about God. It's not somebody else putting words in God's mouth. You know, God does this and God does that. These are written from the standpoint God himself saying these things about himself. And I find them incredibly fascinating here. Isaiah 46, verse 10. Isaiah 46:10, declaring the end from the beginning, that's prophecy, and from the ancient times, the things that are not yet done. So in other words, he predicts things before they happen. He prophesies that things will happen. So things that are not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. So God sits there. He knows the future. That's his job description, basically. He knows the future, and he can write the future down in the present. And when it finally comes, people can look back and say, hey, he wrote this before it happened. Wow, isn't that cool? And it is. Look at chapter 48 of Isaiah. Isaiah 48, verse 3. God says, I have declared the former things from the beginning, and they went forth out of my mouth, and I showed them. I did them suddenly, and they came to pass. What a deal. I mean, he sits there and he says, I can write history any way you want it. I can write it in advance. I can write it in the past. I can write it present tense, future tense, past tense. Doesn't make any difference because I know everything. And every now and then I'll write something here and it'll come to fruition or it'll come to pass over there. Now you deal with it. And in the book of Daniel, there was so much of this going on that subsequent people, by the time we get into the age of, enlightenment and so forth, so-called, and German rationalism that hit in the 17 and 1800s, when these guys are really looking at the Bible from a student standpoint, they look at these promises and these prophecies and they say, these things cannot be. The book had to have been written after these things take place. Because nobody is that sharp. Daniel wasn't that sharp that he could write this stuff in advance. Well, Daniel didn't write this stuff in advance. It was God who wrote it in advance, and he gave it to Daniel to put down on paper. But the book of Daniel is so intricate and so precise that subsequent people just said, no, it can't be. Somebody else had to have written it later. Isaiah 41. Isaiah 41:23. Now, God gets sarcastic here. You can read between the lines. He's just kind of tweaking his nose at people. Isaiah 41:23. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that ye are gods. Yea, do good or do evil, that we may be dismayed and behold it together. He says, you guys think you're hot stuff. Hey, do good, do bad, I don't care. Just put it down in advance. Show the things that are to come hereafter. You think you're so hot? You predict what's going to happen. You write it down. You put your name to it. Sarcastic. I love it. Good grief. So here's Daniel. He's caught in a pickle. Back up to Daniel chapter 2 again. He's caught between a rock and a hard place. Because the wise men couldn't come up with the answer to this thing, and Nebuchadnezzar had threatened them with killing them and making their houses an outhouse, basically. Now Daniel's stuck. What's he to do now? Because he's caught up in this thing. He's slated for execution also. Well, Daniel goes to God. And he goes to God in prayer. And he says, Lord, he says, wow, I didn't see this coming. The edict has gone out from the king. But if somebody doesn't come up with an answer here for this guy in his dream, we're all toast. Verse 46, Daniel chapter 2, verse 46. Well, that's the wrong one. That's going to come later here. Look at Daniel chapter 2, verse 19. Getting all excited here. First day on our new technical setup here. Everybody's confused, including me here. Verse 19, Daniel 2:19. Then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God in heaven. So Daniel goes to the Lord. He said, Lord, we're all slated for execution if somebody doesn't come up with an answer. And he prays to God. Do you think you can give me an answer? And God does. The secret was revealed unto Daniel. Daniel chapter 2, verse 27. Daniel answered in the presence of the king. Now, Daniel is going to get a little bit sarcastic here. Kind of rubs off. You know, when you're in the right, when you have God on your side, when you know what you're doing here based on what God has given you, you can be a little bit sarcastic. Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded, cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show unto the king? I mean, all these hotshot guys made their living, lived a sumptuous life, lived high in the hog. I mean, they're in the capital, they're in the palace. They don't have to go out and work for a living as such. This is their work. But, well, wait just a second, he says. You mean can't the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers, you mean to tell me they couldn't come up with an answer? So Daniel says in verse 28, but there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets. You notice Daniel doesn't take the credit for this. He doesn't say, oh, I came up with this. Oh, I'm the genius. Oh, I'm the great holy guy here. No, Daniel from day one, he gives God the credit. There is a God in heaven that can answer. So verse 28 again. There's a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. Here we come to the crux of the whole thing. This vision has to do with latter days. It has to do with prophecy. And so whatever is encapsulated in this particular vision that Nebuchadnezzar has here, it has to do with future events. And it just so happens to be centered around world history, the successive kingdoms that are going to rule the world from Daniel's time, Nebuchadnezzar's time, until the end when Jesus comes back. So thy dream, he says, in the middle of verse 28, thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. Now he's going to explain it. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into thy mind upon thy bed, what should come to pass hereafter. And he that shall reveal secrets maketh known what shall come to pass. That's God's job, because he knows the end from the beginning. It's no big deal for him. Verse 30, but as for me, the secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sakes that should make known the interpretation to the king, and that thou mightest know the thoughts of thy heart. So Daniel says, I'm not doing this because I'm that sharp. God gave it to me that I could basically save these guys. And why anybody wants to save the magicians, the soothsayers, the fortune tellers, and so forth, I have no idea. But Daniel did. He's a nice guy, great guy. He didn't want to see all these guys, although they're a bunch of shams and crooks and so forth. He didn't want to see them killed. So he goes to bat for them. And when God gives him the vision, he explains, this is why I did it, to save them. Verse 31, thou, O king, sawest, and behold a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. This image's head was of fine gold, his breast and his arms of silver, his belly and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet of part iron and part clay. That's the image that he saw. And then he goes on in verse 34, thou sawest till that a stone was cut without hands, which smote the image from the feet, upon his feet, that were of iron and clay, and break them to pieces. Then the iron and the clay, the brass, the silver, and the gold broken to pieces together and became like chaff in the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain, and it filled the whole earth. Daniel has just put down on paper, he's just put it on record, the succeeding world kingdoms that would succeed his time until the end. Next time, he is going to, now he's just given the vision at this point. He hasn't interpreted yet. He said, we saw a big image, big statue, head of gold, chest and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron, and the feet part iron and part clay. All these elements, the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, they are going to be representatives of kingdoms, of empires. And the succession of them is so spot on that, like I said, people, critics, unbelievers, the scholars, the smart guys of this world looking back on it, say, there's no way that Daniel could have written this in advance. Somebody had to have written it later. So next time we'll look into this image, we'll see how how these parts correspond with the coming world empires. And when I say coming world empires, most of them are already gone. You know, the head of gold, Babylon, that's gone. The arms and the chest of silver, that's the Medo-Persian Empire, that's gone. The belly and the thighs, that was represented by the brass, that empire's gone. The two legs, the Roman Empire, you have the eastern part of the Roman Empire, you have the western part of the Roman Empire, that's basically gone. The extension, and we get down to the feet, part iron, Roman Empire, part clay, something else. We'll get into that when we get to it. But we right now, time-wise, are at the feet. We've passed the Babylonian, we passed the Medo-Persian, we passed the Greek, we passed the Roman, and now we are in a hybrid situation where the world powers today is forming up and it's lining up to be right back where it was in the days of the Roman Empire. The feet, which are the extension of the two legs. So that part of the world that had to do with Israel, North Africa, the Near East, Italy, Greece, that whole area around the Mediterranean Sea, that is all going to come back into play in the end times. So next time, we'll get into that image itself and see how that plays out. All right, Heavenly Father, we do thank you that we have this stuff in front of us. And for someone like myself, it's such an encouragement to see that you, hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of years before an event takes place, you can put it down with such clarity, with such precision, with such detail that it defies description. And it doesn't come as any surprise. I mean, an entity who can manipulate and juggle and keep going the very atoms that comprise not just us, but the world, the solar system, the galaxy, the universe. Colossians tells us, Lord, that you uphold all things by the word of your power. It's just incredible to me, Lord. I mean, we're talking light, we're talking gravity, we're talking black holes, we're talking vortexes, we're talking orbital velocity, we're talking stuff from black holes to planets to people to insects, everything upheld by the power of your word. And if we can't find comfort in that, knowing that you love us, knowing that we are born again, knowing that we have a place in heaven with you, if we can't let that get us through the junk that we experience in this world, whether it's economic, whether it be social, whether it be physical, whether it be relationship-wise, if we can't have the confidence that you can get us through these little nothing type things, and there's no hope for us. But you said that we can. You get us through everything. I can do all things through Christ which strengtheneth me. You said you will never leave us nor forsake us. You will stick with us closer than a brother. Come unto me, all you that labor and are heavy laden. I will give you rest. And so, Father, we come today And I ask you to bless your people, because some are going through problems. Some are having a hard time. For some, it might be relationships. With some, it might be physical. For some, it might be job related, economically. For some, it might be personal things that they're going through. But Father, at the end of the day, if you can maintain this universe, I think you can take care of our problems. It's just that we get so fixated on the immediate, we get so fixated on us that we can't see that you're big enough to take care of it all. The Father, I stop and I bow my head and I thank you. And I ask you to bless your people again in Jesus' name. All right. Next time, we'll continue on with this, and we'll still be in chapter 2, but I hope to see you next time. Thank you much.